In the autumn of 1850, a child was born in Charleston who personified the deepest contradictions of the American soul. Francis James Grimké entered a world defined by the brutalities and intimacies of the Southern plantocracy. Carrying the name of a dynasty built on human bondage while flowing through his veins was the very blood of the men who claimed to own him. He was at once a legal article of property and a biological heir to the most influential slaveholding family in South Carolina. Yet the greatest irony lay not in his birth, but in his destiny, that this boy, born behind the veil of slavery, would eventually use the intellectual tools of his oppressors to dismantle the moral foundations of their world. His life stands as a monumental testament to the intersection of Reformed Orthodoxy and the relentless pursuit of racial justice. Far from being a mere historical figure of the post-Reconstruction era, Grimké represents a bridge between the abolitionist fires of the mid-19th century and the nascent civil rights consciousness of the 20th. His narrative is one of profound paradox, a man born into the brutal machinery of American chattel slavery who would eventually ascend to the heights of intellectual and ecclesiastical influence. His story challenges the conventional dichotomy that often separates sound doctrine from social activism, suggesting instead that for the Black Presbyterian tradition, the two were inextricably linked. The genesis of Francis Grimké's life on October 10, 1850, was marked by the jarring complexities of the antebellum South. To understand Grimké is to understand the complicated history of the American slaveholding class, where the lines between master and slave were frequently blurred by blood, yet enforced by the lash. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina, to Nancy Weston, an enslaved woman, and Henry Grimké, her owner. This biological reality placed Francis at the center of an aristocratic slave-holding lineage, the Grimkés of Charleston, while simultaneously categorizing him as property. This duality of identity was further complicated by the family's broader legacy. While his father presided over an estate built on human bondage, his aunts, Sarah and Angelina Grimké, had already fled the South to become legendary figures in the Quaker, abolitionist, and women's rights movements. Thus, Francis was born into a family that embodied the greatest moral conflict of the nation, one branch profiting from the institution of slavery, the other sacrificing social standing to destroy it. The early years of Francis's life were characterized by a precarious, informal freedom. Following the death of his wife in 1843, Henry Grimké established a domestic arrangement with Nancy Weston that resulted in 3 sons: Archibald Henry, Francis James, and John. This was not a union recognized by law, but it functioned as a familial unit within the confines of the Grimké estate. When Henry died of yellow fever in 1855, he attempted to protect his second family through a legal maneuver that highlighted the fragile nature of Black existence. He bequeathed Nancy and her children to his eldest son and Francis's half-brother, E. Montague Grimké, with the explicit stipulation that they be treated as family members rather than laborers. For 5 years, this arrangement held. Francis lived in a state of virtual freedom, a middle ground existence where the threat of the auction block was temporarily stayed by a father's dying wish and a brother's compliance. However, the institutional weight of slavery eventually overrode the sentimental ties of kinship. In 1860, Montague Grimké discarded the informal agreement and attempted to re-enslave the 3 boys, intending for them to serve as domestic servants for his second wife. This betrayal transformed Francis's world from one of relative domestic stability to one of immediate existential peril. The transition from family member to fugitive forced the young Francis into a series of strategic maneuvers for survival. The institutional violence of the South left no room for passive resistance. In a striking act of irony and desperation, Francis sought to evade Montague's re-enslavement by joining the Confederate Army. Serving for 2 years as a valet to a Confederate officer, he navigated the heart of the rebellion, not out of loyalty to the cause, but as a calculated means of remaining beyond Montague's immediate grasp. This period of his life reflects the paradox of family intimacy and institutional violence that defined the era. In the Confederate camps, he was an observer of the very machinery that sought to keep his people in chains, Yet he used that proximity as a shield against a more personal form of tyranny. Throughout these formative years, the tension between his biological heritage and his legal status created a unique psychological landscape. He was a Grimké by name and blood, yet a slave by law. The survival of Francis and his brothers during this period was not merely a matter of luck. It was the result of strategic action in the face of shifting legal and social tides. He managed to evade Montague's various plots until the collapse of the Confederacy and the arrival of emancipation. The end of the Civil War did more than just break his legal chains. It set the stage for a reclamation of the Grimké name. The inherited abolitionist conviction of his aunts, though he had not yet met them, existed as a dormant family legacy that would eventually provide the scaffolding for his future. His early life in Charleston and his service in the war provided a visceral understanding of American hypocrisy. He had seen the brutalities and intimacies of the South firsthand, and this dual perspective would eventually fuel his prophetic voice. He emerged from the shadow of bondage, not as a broken man, but as one whose identity had been forged in a crucible of contradiction, ready to translate his survival into a pursuit of intellectual and spiritual excellence. Building upon the foundation of his survival in the antebellum South, the next phase of Francis Grimké's life shifted from the physical struggle for liberty to the intellectual struggle for self-determination. The collapse of the Confederacy did not merely end his bondage. It opened a vacuum of opportunity that he and his brothers moved to fill with a calculated, almost relentless academic rigor. The transition from the chaos of the Civil War to the structured environment of Northern academia was facilitated by a pivotal intersection of Reconstruction-era idealism and established abolitionist networks. After emancipation, the trajectory of Francis and his brother Archibald was redirected by Mrs. Frances Pillsbury, an educator and veteran abolitionist who administered the Morris Street School. Her intervention was not merely an act of charity, but a strategic recognition of the brothers' potential to serve as leaders for a newly liberated people. At her urging, they were sent to Massachusetts, a move that physically and symbolically distanced them from the site of their previous enslavement. The Massachusetts years served as a period of grounding and exposure to the industrial and intellectual realities of the North. While residing in Stoneham, Francis worked in a shoe factory, a stark contrast to the valeting duties of his youth, and lived in the barn of a local physician, Dr. John Brown. This period was marked by an intellectual awakening that was both practical and aspirational. The proximity to Dr. Brown's medical practice sparked an early interest in medicine, suggesting that Grimké initially viewed the healing of the body as his primary vocational path. However, the most transformative development during this period was the discovery of his biological connection to Sarah and Angelina Grimké. The revelation that the two most famous white women in the abolitionist movement were his aunts provided more than just social capital. It provided a bridge to elite educational institutions. The aunts, upon learning of their brother's sons, embraced them not as objects of pity, but as kinsmen worthy of investment. They, along with South Carolina school administrators, arranged for Francis to enroll at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. At Lincoln, Francis's intellectual capabilities moved from potential to proven excellence. He did not merely attend, he dominated the academic landscape, graduating in 1870 as the class valedictorian. This achievement was a form of resistance in itself, a systematic refutation of the era's pervasive theories regarding Black intellectual inferiority. His hunger for knowledge led him from medical interests to the study of law, which he began at Lincoln in 1871 and continued at Howard University in Washington, D.C. in 1872. The move to the nation's capital placed him at the heart of Black political and intellectual life, setting the stage for a final vocational shift that would define the rest of his century. The pivot from law to theology was not a rejection of justice, but a realization of its ultimate source. While studying law at Howard University, Grimké experienced a profound spiritual conviction that redirected his pursuit of advocacy from the courtroom to the pulpit. In 1874, he made the consequential decision to leave Howard and enter Princeton Theological Seminary. This move was significant At the time, Princeton was the bastion of old school Presbyterianism, led by the formidable theologian Charles Hodge. The environment at Princeton provided Grimké with a rigorous, reformed framework that would become the permanent architecture of his mind. He was immersed in a tradition that emphasized the absolute sovereignty of God and the high authority of the Scriptures. This reformed theological formation was not a dry academic exercise for Grimké. It was the discovery of an unshakable foundation. He embraced the doctrines of inspiration and inerrancy with a tenacity that never wavered. Decades later, in 1936, he would reflect on this period by noting in his journal that he accepted the Scriptures without reservation as the only hope for humanity. To Grimké, building a life or a movement on anything other than the Word of God was to build on the sand. His time at Princeton, 1874 to 1878, culminated in his earning a doctorate of divinity. This education equipped him with a unique interpretive lens. While many of his white contemporaries used Reformed theology to justify the status quo or remain silent on racial issues, Grimké saw in Calvinism a compelling logic for justice. If God was sovereign over all, then no earthly system, including Jim Crow, could claim ultimate authority. His theological consistency across a lifetime began here. He left Princeton not just as a trained minister, but as a public theologian who viewed the gospel as the ultimate tool for both personal salvation and social transformation. Building upon the theological foundation laid at Princeton, Grimké's emergence into public life was marked by a strategic union of intellect, faith, and heritage. His entry into the pastorate was not merely a career milestone, but the beginning of a 60-year campaign to synchronize the moral demands of the gospel with the lived reality of Black Americans. Upon his graduation from Princeton in 1878, Grimké was immediately thrust into the epicenter of African American intellectual and social life. He accepted the call to lead the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., an affluent and influential congregation that served as a hub for the city's Black elite. However, the most significant development of that year occurred in December, when he married Charlotte Fortin. This union was far more than a domestic arrangement. It was a union of reform families that consolidated two of the most significant abolitionist and activist lineages in American history. Charlotte was the granddaughter of James Fortin, Sr., a legendary Philadelphia businessman and one of the primary financiers of the early abolitionist movement. She brought to the marriage an activist character, inherited from her grandfather and refined through her own experiences as a teacher among the formerly enslaved on the Sea Islands during the Civil War. At 41, she was 13 years Francis's senior, bringing a maturity and a network of connections that amplified his burgeoning prophetic witness. Together, they formed a formidable duo, a partnership where the theological rigor of the husband was complemented by the seasoned social consciousness of the wife. Their shared mission for racial justice and women's rights was deepened by personal tragedy amid public mission. In June 1880, they celebrated the birth of their only child, a daughter, only to suffer her death in infancy. This loss did not derail their work, but rather seemed to temper it, providing a profound depth of empathy to their pastoral and social advocacy. The Fortin-Grimké alliance demonstrated that the fight for justice was a multi-generational effort, where family legacy served as a catalyst for sustained radical activism. Francis Grimké's tenure at 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which spanned nearly 6 decades, interrupted only by a brief 4-year period in Jacksonville, Florida, became the stage for a sustained witness that was both deeply theological and aggressively political. He rejected the notion that a pastor's duty was confined to the spiritual realm alone. Instead, he utilized the pulpit to expose national and ecclesiastical hypocrisy. Grimké's sermons were characterized by intellectual rigor in service of prophetic truth. He argued that because the scriptures were the final authority, any system, be it the laws of the United States or the internal structures of the Presbyterian Church, that denied the full humanity of Black people was a direct affront to God. He was a relentless critic of American hypocrisy, most notably during World War I. He publicly protested the recruitment of black soldiers to fight for democracy abroad while they were systematically denied domestic freedom and dignity at home. This was not merely political commentary, it was a theological indictment of a nation that claimed to be Christian while practicing the idolatry of race. Within his own denomination, Grimké was a thorn in the side of institutional racism. He contended that the church's failure to offer equal rights and opportunities to its black members was not just a social oversight but a failure of orthodoxy. For Grimké, biblical fidelity and social justice were inseparable. If one believed in the Reformed view of the sovereignty of God and the depravity of man, then one must necessarily stand against the institutional violence of racism, which sought to place one race in the position of God over another. His life's work demonstrated that faith acts as a catalyst for justice, turning the quiet halls of the seminary into a front line for human rights. Building upon his pastoral work, Grimké's influence extended beyond the walls of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, as he recognized that the struggle for black dignity required both institutional reform and broader civic engagement. His mature years were defined by his role as a bridge builder between the radical abolitionist past and the organized civil rights future. Grimké's commitment to justice was not merely local, it was structural. He understood that the theological consistency he preached required a corresponding political mobilization. This led him to become a foundational figure in the organized movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1899, he was a key participant in the founding of the American Negro Academy, the first organization in the United States dedicated to African American higher scholarship. For Grimké, the pursuit of intellectual excellence was a prerequisite for leadership, providing the necessary tools to dismantle the pseudo-scientific racism of the era. His advocacy found its most potent expression in his involvement with the Niagara Movement and, subsequently, the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, ACP. Within these organizations, Grimké acted as a moral compass. He was famously critical of the accommodationist strategies that suggested black progress could be achieved through industrial labor alone, while sacrificing civil rights. Grimké argued that any strategy that did not demand full citizenship and equality was a concession to the sin of white supremacy. His leadership was particularly evident in his response to the ecclesiastical silence regarding the lynching epidemic. He saw the failure of white denominations to condemn the murder of black citizens as a profound apostasy. By leveraging his national platform, he forced a dialogue on Christian responsibility in the public square, insisting that a church that did not stand for the oppressed was a church that had abandoned the gospel. As Francis Grimké entered the final chapter of his life, his role shifted to that of a venerable sage for a new generation of activists. Having lived through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the rise of Jim Crow, he possessed a historical perspective that few could match. He spent his later years from 1928 to 1937 meticulously documenting his thoughts in journals, creating a theological and social archive that sought to preserve the lessons of his struggle. His death on October 11, 1937, marked the end of an era, yet his influence remained foundational. Grimké served as a bridge figure, connecting the abolitionist legacy of his aunts and the Fortin family to the emerging 20th century civil rights consciousness. He proved that Reformed theological training was not a barrier to social activism, but a profound catalyst for it. He challenged the Church to see that doctrinal precision and prophetic witness were not mutually exclusive, but were, in fact, two sides of the same biblical coin. The enduring relevance of Grimké's life lies in his refusal to compartmentalize his faith. He died as he had lived, a public theologian who believed that the sovereignty of God demanded the liberation of man. His story remains a vital, though often overlooked, chapter of the American Reformed tradition, a reminder that the most rigorous theology is that which is lived out in the pursuit of justice. Francis Grimké once noted that he accepted the scriptures without reservation. As you consider his journey from a Charleston workhouse to the halls of Princeton, ask yourself, does my theology provide me with a foundation strong enough to withstand systemic injustice? or is it merely a private comfort? If the Westminster Shorter Catechism reminds us that our chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, how does that glorifying manifest in a world still broken by the legacies Grimké fought to dismantle? Church history is deeper than we were taught. To understand the full scope of the Christian witness, we must recover the lost voices of theology. Subscribe to Theology Today for a weekly exploration into the figures, movements, and doctrines that have been left on the cutting room floor of history.